Was about to walk away from the crime scene when she leaned in and whispered, "Check his left pocket." What he found inside changed everything he thought he knew about the case, and about who he could trust. Thank you so much for watching and for all your comments. Let me know at the end if you liked the story, and where you're watching from and why you're following this. The autumn rain fell in heavy sheets across the cobblestone streets of Boston, Massachusetts, turning the gas-lit avenues into rivers of amber light and shadow. It was October of 1895, and the city wore the season like a velvet cloak, elegant yet somber, beautiful yet melancholic. The grand brownstone mansions of Beacon Hill stood like sentinels against the storm, their windows glowing warmly while the rest of the world grew cold and dark. Inside one such mansion, the renowned detective Alexander Montgomery stood before a marble fireplace, his tall, imposing frame casting long shadows across the Persian rug beneath his feet. At 32 years of age, Alexander had already made a name for himself among Boston's elite. His sharp intellect and unwavering dedication to justice had solved cases that baffled even the most experienced officers of the Boston Police Department. But it was not merely his detective work that had brought him fame and fortune. Alexander was the sole heir to the Montgomery shipping empire, a business his late father had built from nothing into one of the most prosperous ventures in New England. The combination of his brilliant mind and considerable wealth had earned him the moniker that newspapers loved to print, the billionaire detective. Yet tonight, as he stared into the dancing flames, Alexander felt none of the satisfaction that usually accompanied the closing of a case. His dark eyes, framed by strong features and a jawline that spoke of determination, reflected something closer to frustration. The case of the missing Hartwell diamonds had concluded successfully just 3 days prior, but something about it nagged at him, some detail he could not quite place. His butler, the elderly and faithful James, entered the study with measured steps. "Sir, there is a young woman at the door. She insists on speaking with you, despite the late hour. She says it is a matter of utmost urgency." Alexander turned from the fire, his interest piqued. "Did she provide a name?" "Miss Josephine Ashford, sir. She appears quite distressed, if I may say so. The rain has soaked through her cloak and she trembles, though whether from cold or fear I cannot say." Alexander nodded. "Show her in, James, and bring tea, something warm for the lady." Within moments, James returned, ushering in a young woman who seemed to carry the storm itself in her wake. Josephine Ashford was perhaps 24 or 25 years of age, with auburn hair that had escaped its pins in the rain, falling in damp waves around her face. Her eyes were a striking shade of green, wide with what Alexander immediately recognized as genuine fear. She was beautiful, he noted with a start, though her beauty was of the understated kind, the sort that revealed itself slowly, like a dawn breaking over the harbor. Her dress, though modest and now quite wet, was well made, suggesting she came from a respectable family, if not a wealthy one. "Mr. Montgomery," she began, her voice soft yet steady despite the trembling of her hands, "I apologize for the intrusion at such an hour. I would not have come if the matter were not desperate." Alexander gestured to a chair near the fire. "Please, Miss Ashford, sit. You are shivering. James will bring tea momentarily." She sank into the chair with visible relief, and Alexander took the seat opposite her, studying her face with the careful attention that had made him such a successful detective. There was intelligence in those green eyes, and something else, a determination that matched her fear. "Now then," Alexander said gently, "tell me what has brought you to my door on such a terrible night." Josephine drew a deep breath, gathering herself. "My brother, Mr. Montgomery. My younger brother, Thomas. He has been accused of a terrible crime, one I know with absolute certainty he did not commit. The police arrested him this very evening, and they say they have evidence that I fear has been planted to frame him. What is the nature of the accusation?" "Theft," she replied, her voice breaking slightly on the word. "They claim he stole a valuable pocket watch from Mr. Edmund Whitmore, one of the wealthiest merchants in Boston. Mr. Whitmore's son, Gerald, swears he saw Thomas take it during a gathering at their home last week. But Thomas was with me that entire evening. He never went near Mr. Whitmore's study where the watch was supposedly kept." Alexander leaned forward, his interest deepening. "The Whitmores. I know the family. Edmund Whitmore is indeed a prominent figure in Boston's business circles. Tell me, Miss Ashford, what is your brother's connection to the Whitmore family?" A flush colored Josephine's pale cheeks. Thomas works as a clerk at Whitmore and Sons. It is a modest position, but he has worked diligently for 3 years, hoping to advance. Mr. Whitmore seemed pleased with his work, or so Thomas believed. This accusation came as a complete shock to us both. James returned with the tea service, and Alexander waited as Josephine accepted a cup with grateful hands. She sipped the hot liquid, and some of the color returned to her face. Alexander found himself studying her more closely than professional detachment would normally allow. There was something about her presence that commanded attention, not through ostentation or dramatics, but through an innate grace and dignity that even fear and distress could not diminish. "Miss Ashford," Alexander began carefully, "you said you fear the evidence was planted. What makes you believe this?" Josephine set down her cup and met his gaze directly. "Because Thomas would never steal. But more than that, Mr. Montgomery, because I overheard something I was not meant to hear. 2 days ago, I went to deliver Thomas's lunch to the office, as I sometimes do. I arrived early and heard voices from Mr. Whitmore's private office. The door was slightly ajar, and I heard Gerald Whitmore speaking to someone. I could not see whom. Gerald said, and I remember his words exactly, 'The matter will be resolved by week's end. The little clerk will be dealt with, and no one will question it.'" Alexander's expression sharpened. "You are certain of these words?" "As certain as I am of my own name, sir. At the time I did not understand their meaning. I thought perhaps Thomas was being considered for dismissal. But now, with this accusation, I understand perfectly. This is not about a stolen watch. This is about removing my brother from Whitmore and Sons. But I cannot fathom why." The detective rose and paced before the fire, his mind already working through the possibilities. "Has your brother made any enemies at the company? Has he witnessed anything unusual in his work? Any financial irregularities, perhaps?" Josephine considered this carefully. "Thomas has mentioned that the account seemed unusual in recent months. He said nothing specific, but he did express concern about certain discrepancies. He intended to speak with Mr. Whitmore about them, to ensure there were no errors in his own work, but he never had the chance." The accusation came first. Alexander felt the familiar thrill of a puzzle beginning to take shape. "Miss Ashford, I will help you, but I must be honest. If your brother is in custody, time is not on our side. The preliminary hearing will likely be scheduled within days. We must work quickly to uncover the truth." Relief flooded Josephine's features, and for a moment, Alexander saw the fear recede from those remarkable eyes. "Thank you, Mr. Montgomery. I have no way to repay you for your kindness, but I swear I will find a way." Alexander waved away her concern. "We shall discuss payment later, if at all. For now, I need you to tell me everything you know about the Whitmore family, about the gathering where the watch supposedly went missing, and about your brother's work. Leave out no detail, no matter how insignificant it may seem." For the next hour, Josephine recounted everything she could remember. She spoke of the Whitmore family, Edmund, the patriarch, who had built his fortune in the textile trade, his wife, Constance, who was known for her charity work, and their son, Gerald, who at 28 was being groomed to take over the family business. She described the gathering, a small dinner party to which Thomas had been invited as a gesture of goodwill from Mr. Whitmore. She detailed Thomas's work as a clerk, his meticulous nature, his honesty. As she spoke, Alexander found himself not only absorbing the information, but also observing the woman before him. Josephine Ashford was no mere damsel in distress. She spoke with clarity and precision, providing exactly the kind of detailed account that would prove most useful in an investigation. She was educated, certainly, and possessed a sharp mind. More than once she offered insights that showed she had already been analyzing the situation herself, trying to make sense of the accusations against her brother. "There is one more thing," Josephine said as the hour grew later. "The watch that was supposedly stolen. I saw it. At the dinner party, Mr. Whitmore showed it to several guests. It was an extraordinary piece, gold with intricate engravings, and he said it had been in his family for generations. But Mr. Montgomery, when he showed it to us, I noticed something odd. The watch had an inscription on the back, 'To Edmund, for services rendered, 1870. That struck me as strange for a family heirloom." Alexander's eyebrows rose. "An excellent observation, Miss Ashford. You have the instincts of a detective yourself." A small smile touched her lips, the first he had seen since her arrival. I have always enjoyed mysteries, Mr. Montgomery, though I never imagined I would find myself in the middle of one. We shall solve this mystery together, Alexander said, surprised by his own words. He was not accustomed to working with clients so directly, yet something about Josephine made him want to include her in the investigation. Tomorrow morning, I will visit the police station and speak with your brother. I will also make inquiries about Mr. Whitmore and his business affairs. In the meantime, you should return home and rest. You have had a trying day. Josephine rose, and Alexander stood as well. For a moment they faced each other across the study, and Alexander felt something shift in the air between them. It was indefinable, intangible, yet unmistakable, a connection forming, like the first notes of a melody just beginning to play. Mr. Montgomery, Josephine said softly, I cannot thank you enough. Thomas is all the family I have left. Our parents passed away 5 years ago, and we have only each other. The thought of losing him to a false accusation is unbearable. You will not lose him, Alexander replied with a conviction that surprised even himself. I give you my word, Miss Ashford. We will prove his innocence. As James escorted Josephine to the door and called for the Montgomery carriage to take her home, despite her protests, Alexander returned to the fire. But this time, when he stared into the flames, it was not frustration that filled his thoughts. It was the image of green eyes filled with determination, of auburn hair catching the firelight, of a voice that spoke with quiet strength, and underneath it all, the intriguing mystery of a stolen watch that might not be an heirloom at all, and a young clerk who might have stumbled upon secrets someone was willing to destroy him to protect. The rain continued to fall outside, but inside the Montgomery mansion, Alexander felt the familiar stirring of purpose. This case would be different from all the others, he sensed, not just because of the mystery itself, but because of the remarkable woman who had brought it to his door. As he finally retired for the night, Alexander Montgomery found himself already planning the next day's investigation with an energy and anticipation he had not felt in years. Tomorrow, the real work would begin. Morning arrived with a pale, hesitant sunlight that struggled to break through the lingering clouds over Boston. Alexander Montgomery had risen early, his mind already focused on the case at hand. He dressed in a tailored suit of dark gray wool, the kind that commanded respect in any setting, whether a drawing room or a police station. As he fastened his gold cufflinks, a gift from his late father, he found his thoughts returning repeatedly to Josephine Ashford and the urgency in her voice the previous evening. By 8 o'clock, Alexander's personal carriage was making its way through the morning traffic of Boston, the horses' hooves clopping steadily against the wet cobblestones. The city was awakening around him, shopkeepers opening their establishments, newspaper boys calling out headlines, well-dressed gentlemen and ladies beginning their daily routines. But Alexander's destination was far less pleasant than the theaters and shops that lined the better streets of Boston. The city jail was a grim, imposing structure of gray stone that seemed to absorb what little sunlight managed to reach it. Alexander had been here many times before, and the guards knew him well. His reputation, combined with generous donations to the Police Benevolent Fund, ensured that doors opened readily for him. Mr. Montgomery, greeted Sergeant Patrick O'Malley, a burly Irishman with a weathered face and shrewd eyes. Didn't expect to see you here this morning. What brings you to our humble establishment? I'm here to see Thomas Ashford, the young man brought in last evening on theft charges. O'Malley's expression shifted slightly, a flicker of something that might have been discomfort. That one. Open and shut case, I'm afraid. Caught red-handed, according to the witness. The preliminary hearing is set for 3 days hence. Nevertheless, I'd like to speak with him. I've been retained to look into the matter. The sergeant nodded and led Alexander through a series of corridors that echoed with the sounds of misery. Coughs, murmured conversations, the clang of metal doors. Finally, they reached a cell where a young man sat on a narrow cot, his head in his hands. When he looked up at their approach, Alexander saw the family resemblance immediately. Thomas Ashford had the same auburn hair as his sister, though his eyes were brown rather than green. He was perhaps 20 years old, with a slight build and the ink-stained fingers of a clerk. His face was pale with fear and exhaustion. You have a visitor, Ashford, O'Malley announced, unlocking the cell door. I'll give you privacy, Mr. Montgomery. Take your time. Once they were alone, Alexander introduced himself and explained that Josephine had sought his help. The relief that washed over Thomas's face was immediate and profound. "Thank God," Thomas breathed. "Mr. Montgomery, I swear to you on my parents' graves I did not take that watch. I would never steal anything, let alone from Mr. Whitmore. He gave me my position when no one else would hire me after Father's business failed. I owe him everything." Alexander sat on the cell's single chair, his posture relaxed, but his eyes sharp. "Tell me exactly what happened at the gathering. Every detail you can remember." Thomas took a steadying breath. "It was last Tuesday evening. Mr. Whitmore invited several of his employees to dinner, a rare gesture of goodwill. There were perhaps a dozen of us, along with his family. Mrs. Whitmore was very gracious, and even Gerald seemed pleasant enough, though he usually keeps his distance from us clerks. During the evening, Mr. Whitmore showed us his pocket watch. He was very proud of it, passing it around so we could all admire it. I held it for perhaps 30 seconds, no more, then passed it to the man beside me, Mr. Harrison from accounting. And after that, nothing unusual. We finished dinner, had brandy in the drawing room, and I left around 10 o'clock. I went straight home where Josephine was waiting. She had been visiting our aunt in Cambridge that day. I thought nothing more of it until yesterday when the police came to the office and arrested me in front of everyone. Alexander leaned forward. "Thomas, your sister mentioned that you had noticed some irregularities in the company accounts. Tell me about that." Thomas glanced toward the corridor nervously, then lowered his voice. "I probably should not have said anything to Josephine. I did not want to worry her. But yes, Mr. Montgomery, I noticed something strange about 3 months ago. There were discrepancies in the ledgers. Money that appeared to be going to suppliers that I could not find records of in our usual files. When I cross-referenced the payments with shipping manifests, the numbers did not match. Goods supposedly purchased never appeared in our warehouses. How much money are we discussing? Over the past year? Perhaps $50,000, possibly more. It is difficult to say without a complete audit." Alexander felt a cold certainty settling in his chest. $50,000 was more than enough motive for someone to want a too curious clerk removed from the picture. "Did you share these concerns with anyone at the company?" "I mentioned it to Mr. Harrison, but he told me I must be mistaken, that Mr. Whitmore's accounts were beyond reproach. I was preparing to speak directly to Mr. Whitmore himself, but then this happened." Thomas's voice cracked slightly. "Mr. Montgomery, I am terrified. If I am convicted, I could spend years in prison. And Josephine, she has no one else. What will become of her?" "Your sister is stronger than you might think," Alexander said, thinking of the determined woman who had braved a storm to seek his help. "And you will not be convicted, Thomas. I give you my word. But I need you to write down everything you remember about those financial discrepancies. Every supplier name, every amount, every date. Can you do that?" Thomas nodded eagerly. "Yes, absolutely. I have most of it memorized. The figures have been haunting my dreams for months." Alexander arranged for paper and pencil to be brought to the cell, then left Thomas to his work. As he departed the jail, his mind was already racing ahead to the next steps of the investigation. The pieces were beginning to fall into place, and the picture they formed was one of corruption and greed. His next destination was the commercial district, where Whitmore and Sons maintained their offices and warehouse. The building was a solid structure of red brick, 3 stories tall, with the company name emblazoned in gold letters above the entrance. Alexander entered with the confidence of a man who belonged anywhere he chose to go. The reception area was modest but well appointed, with dark wood paneling and gas lamps that cast a warm glow despite the gray day outside. A young woman sat at a desk, and she looked up with a professional smile that faltered slightly when she saw Alexander's expensive attire and commanding presence. "Good morning, sir. How may I assist you?" "I am here to see Mr. Edmund Whitmore. My name is Alexander Montgomery." Recognition flashed across her face. Everyone in Boston knew the name Montgomery. "Of course, Mr. Montgomery. I shall see if Mr. Whitmore is available. May I tell him the nature of your business?" "Tell him it concerns a delicate matter that requires his immediate attention." Within minutes, Alexander was being escorted to the 3rd floor, where Edmund Whitmore's private office overlooked the bustling warehouse below. Whitmore himself was a man in his late 50s, with silver hair and the prosperous appearance of someone who had never known real hardship. His office reflected his success: leather-bound books, an enormous mahogany desk, and paintings of ships that likely represented his business interests. "Mr. Montgomery," Whitmore said, rising with an outstretched hand, "this is an unexpected honor. I have followed your detective work in the newspapers with great interest. Please, sit. What brings you to my humble establishment?" Alexander shook the offered hand, noting the firmness of the grip, a man who wanted to be seen as strong and capable. "Mr. Whitmore, I shall come directly to the point. I have been retained to investigate the case of Thomas Ashford." The warmth in Whitmore's expression cooled considerably. That unfortunate young man. Such a shame. He seemed like such a promising clerk. "But the evidence is quite clear, Mr. Montgomery. My son witnessed the theft with his own eyes." "Indeed. I find that curious, given that Miss Josephine Ashford provides an alibi for her brother that contradicts the timeline of the alleged theft." Whitmore's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Miss Ashford is his sister. One would expect her to protect him, even if it means bending the truth." "One would," Alexander agreed pleasantly. "Tell me about the watch itself. I understand it was a family heirloom." "Yes, passed down from my grandfather. An item of tremendous sentimental value beyond its considerable monetary worth. Yet it bore an inscription dated 1870, if I am correctly informed, to Edmund for services rendered. That seems an unusual inscription for a grandfather to place on a family heirloom, does it not?" For the first time, Whitmore's composure cracked. His eyes narrowed, and a muscle worked in his jaw. "I see Miss Ashford has been very thorough in her storytelling. The inscription is a private family matter, Mr. Montgomery. It has no bearing on the theft." "Perhaps not," Alexander said, his tone remaining light. "I wonder, though, might I speak with your son, Gerald? As the primary witness, his testimony will be crucial to the case. Gerald is not here at present. He is attending to business matters in New York and will not return until the hearing." "How convenient." The words hung in the air between them, and Whitmore's face flushed with anger. "Mr. Montgomery, I am not sure what game you are playing, but I must warn you. I have considerable influence in this city. If you persist in defending a thief, you may find that even the Montgomery name cannot protect you from the consequences." Alexander stood, his full height and imposing presence suddenly filling the office. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, but carried an edge of steel. "Mr. Whitmore, I do not respond well to threats. I suggest you save your influence for those who might be impressed by it. Good day, sir." As Alexander descended the stairs, his mind was working rapidly. Whitmore's reaction had told him everything he needed to know. The man was hiding something, and Gerald's convenient absence was no coincidence. But proving it would require more than suspicions and logical deductions. He returned to his carriage and directed the driver to take him to the office of his personal attorney and investigator, Samuel Green. Green was a brilliant legal mind with connections throughout Boston's business community. If anyone could help uncover the truth about Whitmore and Sons' financial dealings, it was he. The afternoon passed in intensive work. Green agreed to conduct a discreet investigation into Whitmore's business records, using his connections with banks and suppliers. Alexander also hired 2 private investigators to watch the Whitmore residence and office, noting everyone who came and went. As evening approached, Alexander found himself thinking of Josephine Ashford. He had promised to keep her informed, but more than duty compelled him. He wanted to see her again, to reassure her that progress was being made. There was something about her that had captured his attention in a way that went beyond professional interest. She had shown courage in coming to him, intelligence in her observations, and a fierce loyalty to her brother that spoke of strength of character. He directed his driver to the address Josephine had provided, a modest but respectable boarding house in a quiet neighborhood. The building was well maintained, with window boxes that would have been full of flowers in another season. Alexander knocked on the door, and when the landlady answered, he asked for Miss Ashford. "She's in the parlor, sir." "Shall I announce you?" "Please tell her that Alexander Montgomery is here to see her." Moments later, Josephine appeared, and Alexander felt his breath catch slightly. She wore a simple dress of deep blue that brought out the color of her eyes, and her auburn hair was neatly arranged. But it was the hope in her expression that truly arrested him. "Mr. Montgomery, please come in. Have you news?" They settled in the boarding house's small parlor, which was thankfully empty at this hour. Alexander related the day's events, leaving out nothing. He watched as Josephine's expression shifted from hope to concern to determination. "So, you believe Mr. Whitmore is involved in financial impropriety?" and that Thomas discovered evidence of it? I am nearly certain of it. The question is how to prove it and how to connect it definitively to the false accusation against your brother. Without Gerald Whitmore's testimony, we cannot directly contradict the theft claim. And Edmund Whitmore has ensured his son is conveniently absent. Josephine was quiet for a moment, her brow furrowed in thought. Then she looked up at Alexander with sudden intensity. The watch. That is the key, is it not? If it truly was a family heirloom, there should be records of it. Insurance documents, perhaps, or family papers. But if it was acquired more recently, in 1870, as the inscription suggests, then it was not stolen property at all, but something Mr. Whitmore is using as a prop for his false accusation. Alexander felt admiration surge through him. Miss Ashford, you continue to impress me with your reasoning. That is precisely my thinking. If we can prove the watch's true provenance, we undermine the entire case. Then we must find out where the watch came from, Josephine said firmly. And I believe I know how we might do that. There is a jeweler on Tremont Street, Mr. Nathaniel Winters. He is known for his discretion with wealthy clients. Thomas mentioned once that Mr. Whitmore had purchased several items from him over the years. If the watch came from Mr. Winters, he might have records of the sale. It is worth investigating, Alexander agreed. I shall visit him tomorrow morning. We shall visit him, Josephine corrected gently but firmly. Mr. Montgomery, I know it is unconventional for a lady to involve herself so directly in such matters, but Thomas is my brother. I cannot sit idly by while others work to save him. And besides, I may be able to assist. Mr. Winters knows me. I have sold several pieces of my mother's jewelry to him over the years to supplement our income. He trusts me. Alexander found himself torn between propriety and practicality. Everything in his upbringing and social position told him that a lady should not be involved in detective work. Yet everything in his instincts told him that Josephine Ashford was no ordinary lady, and that her presence might indeed be an asset rather than a hindrance. Very well, he said at last. We shall go together tomorrow morning. But Miss Ashford, I must ask you to follow my lead if the situation becomes delicate. A smile touched her lips, transforming her face with sudden warmth. I shall endeavor to be a model of feminine propriety, Mr. Montgomery, while still being useful. Their eyes met, and Alexander felt that connection again, stronger now. There was something happening between them, something that went beyond the case, beyond their roles as detective and client. In the soft lamplight of the boarding-house parlor, with the evening shadows gathering outside, Alexander found himself seeing not just a woman who needed his help, but a partner, an equal, someone whose mind matched his own in ways he had never expected to find. Until tomorrow, then, he said softly, rising to leave. 10 o'clock? I shall be ready, Josephine replied, walking him to the door. And Mr. Montgomery, thank you, not just for your help, but for believing in Thomas, and for believing in me. As Alexander's carriage carried him home through the darkening streets, he reflected on the strange turn his life had taken in just 24 hours. He had begun this case as he began all cases, with professional detachment and analytical precision. But now, with Josephine Ashford's green eyes lingering in his memory and the sound of her voice echoing in his mind, Alexander found himself personally invested in a way that both thrilled and unsettled him. Tomorrow would bring new revelations, he was certain. But tonight, he allowed himself to simply anticipate seeing her again, and to wonder at the unexpected direction his heart seemed determined to take. The morning of their visit to the jeweler arrived with crystalline autumn sunlight that made Boston's architecture gleam as though the city itself had been polished overnight. Alexander's carriage arrived at Josephine's boarding house precisely at 10 o'clock, and he found her waiting in the small vestibule, dressed in a tailored walking suit of burgundy wool with black trim. A small hat perched atop her carefully arranged auburn hair, and she carried a black leather reticule. She looked every inch the respectable young lady, yet Alexander could see the determination burning in those remarkable green eyes. "Good morning, Mr. Montgomery," she greeted him as he handed her into the carriage. "I confess I barely slept last night. I kept thinking about the watch and what we might discover today." "As did I," Alexander admitted, settling into the seat across from her. The carriage began moving through the morning traffic, and he found himself acutely aware of her presence in the confined space. The faint scent of lavender water, the way the sunlight caught in her hair, the intelligence in her gaze as she looked out at the passing city. "I have been thinking," Josephine said, turning back to him. If Mr. Whitmore did purchase the watch in 1870, that was 25 years ago. He would have been in his early 30s then, just beginning to build his business. The inscription said, "For services rendered." What if those services were not entirely legitimate? What if the watch itself was payment for something he did not wish to record in official accounts? Alexander leaned forward with interest. "You are suggesting the watch might be evidence of earlier corruption? That is a fascinating theory, Miss Ashford. If true, it would explain why Whitmore is so desperate to keep anyone from examining it too closely." "Exactly," Josephine said, her eyes bright with excitement. "And if Thomas's arrest prevents him from testifying about the current financial irregularities, it serves a double purpose, silencing a potential witness while also ensuring no one questions the watch's provenance." "Miss Ashford," Alexander said with genuine admiration, "you have a natural talent for investigation. Has anyone ever told you that?" A faint blush colored her cheeks. "My father used to say I asked too many questions and noticed too many details for a young lady. He meant it as criticism, but I always took it as a compliment." Their carriage arrived at Tremont Street, where the shops catered to Boston's wealthy elite. Nathaniel Winter's establishment was marked by a discreet sign in elegant script and windows displaying exquisite pieces of jewelry on velvet cushions. A bell chimed softly as they entered. The interior was hushed and refined, with dark wood cases displaying rings, necklaces, and brooches that caught the light like captured stars. An elderly gentleman emerged from the back room, his spectacles perched on a long nose, his fingers showing the calluses of a craftsman who had spent decades working with precious metals. "Miss Ashford," he said with genuine warmth. Then his gaze shifted to Alexander with curiosity and a touch of wariness. "And companion, how may I assist you today?" "Mr. Winters," Josephine said with a gentle smile, "may I introduce Mr. Alexander Montgomery? He is helping me with a delicate family matter. We were hoping you might answer some questions for us." The jeweler's expression became more cautious. "What kind of questions?" Alexander stepped forward, his voice respectful but firm. "Mr. Winters, we are investigating a pocket watch that may have passed through your establishment approximately 25 years ago. It is gold, with intricate engravings, and bears an inscription on the back, 'To Edmund, for services rendered, 1870. Does this sound familiar?" Winters removed his spectacles and cleaned them slowly. A delaying tactic, Alexander recognized. "Gentlemen and lady, you must understand that my business depends on discretion. My clients trust me to maintain their privacy." "Mr. Winters," Josephine said softly, stepping closer, "my brother is in jail, falsely accused of stealing that very watch. He faces years in prison for a crime he did not commit. I am not asking you to betray anyone's trust without cause, but surely justice must take precedence over discretion." The jeweler looked at her searchingly, then sighed deeply. "Thomas Ashford is your brother? I read about the arrest in the newspaper. A terrible business." He was quiet for a long moment, clearly wrestling with his conscience. Finally, he nodded. "Come into my workshop. What I have to show you cannot be discussed in the open shop." They followed him through a doorway into a cluttered but meticulously organized workspace. Tools hung on the walls in precise arrangements, and a large desk dominated the center of the room, covered with sketches and half-finished pieces. Winters went to a large safe in the corner, worked the combination, and withdrew a leather-bound ledger. "I keep records of every significant commission and purchase," he explained, laying the ledger on the desk and flipping through pages until he found what he sought. "Here, October 1870. One gold pocket watch, custom-made, with requested inscription. Commissioned by Mr. Edmund Whitmore. Payment, $500 in cash." Alexander and Josephine leaned over the ledger, reading the entry carefully. It was exactly as Winters had described, but there was more. In smaller script beneath the main entry, Winters had written, "Client specified exact wording of inscription. Emphasized confidential nature of transaction. No certificate of authenticity to be issued." "This is highly irregular," Alexander said. "Why would someone request no certificate of authenticity for such an expensive piece?" Winters shrugged. "At the time, I assumed Mr. Whitmore had his reasons. Perhaps it was a gift for a mistress, something he did not want traced back to him. It was not my place to question. But I will tell you this, the watch was never presented as a family heirloom. It was a new commission, made specifically to those specifications." "May we have a copy of this entry?" Alexander asked. "It could be crucial evidence." The jeweler hesitated, then nodded slowly. For Miss Ashford's brother, yes. But I must ask that my name be kept out of this matter as much as possible. I am an old man, Mr. Montgomery, and I cannot afford to lose the patronage of men like Edmund Whitmore. I shall do everything in my power to protect you, Mr. Winters, Alexander assured him. You have my word. As Winters carefully copied the ledger entry onto a separate piece of paper, Josephine moved closer to Alexander, her voice dropping to a whisper. This proves the watch was not stolen property because it was never a family heirloom in the first place. But we still need to prove that Thomas did not take it. One step at a time, Alexander murmured back, acutely aware of her proximity, the warmth of her presence. This gives us ammunition. Now we need to discover what those services rendered actually were. Armed with the jeweler's documentation, they returned to Alexander's carriage. The autumn day had grown warmer, and the streets were busy with the commerce of the city. But inside the carriage, a different kind of energy crackled between its two occupants. What is our next move? Josephine asked as they drove through the city. We need to examine Whitmore and Sons records from 1870, Alexander said thoughtfully. If there were irregular transactions, then there may be a pattern that connects to the current discrepancies Thomas discovered. But accessing those records will be difficult. Whitmore certainly will not grant us permission. Josephine bit her lip, thinking. Then her expression changed, a mixture of determination and something that might have been mischief. Mr. Montgomery, what if we did not ask permission? Alexander looked at her sharply. Miss Ashford, what are you suggesting? I am suggesting that sometimes justice requires one to be creative. The offices of Whitmore and Sons are closed on Sundays. Tomorrow is Saturday, which means Sunday is our last chance to search those records before the preliminary hearing on Monday. If we could gain access to the building, to the archives where old ledgers would be kept. You are proposing we break into Edmund Whitmore's offices, Alexander said flatly. I am proposing we retrieve evidence that could free my brother from false imprisonment, Josephine countered, her green eyes flashing. Is that not what detectives do, Mr. Montgomery? Whatever is necessary to uncover the truth. Alexander found himself torn between admiration for her courage and concern for her safety. Miss Ashford, Josephine, he said, using her given name for the first time. What you are suggesting is dangerous. If we were caught, the consequences would be severe. More severe than my brother spending years in prison for a crime he did not commit. She leaned forward, her hand resting briefly on his arm, and Alexander felt the touch like an electric current. Please, Alexander, I know I am asking a great deal, but I cannot stand by and do nothing when the means to save Thomas is within our reach. The sound of his given name on her lips affected him more than he cared to admit. In that moment, with her hand on his arm and determination blazing in her eyes, Alexander knew he would have done anything she asked. It was not merely her beauty that compelled him, nor even the justice of her cause, but something deeper, the recognition of a kindred spirit, someone who understood that sometimes the letter of the law must bend to serve true justice. Very well, he said quietly, but we do this carefully and we do it together. I will not have you taking risks alone. Relief and gratitude flooded her expression. Thank you, Alexander. I promise you will not regret this. As the carriage continued through Boston's streets, they began to plan. Alexander knew the layout of the Whitmore building from his visit, and Josephine had been there several times when bringing Thomas his lunch. Between them, they pieced together a strategy. They would enter through a ground-floor window that Alexander had noticed was partially hidden by overgrown shrubbery. Once inside, they would make their way to the third floor where the archives were kept. With luck, they could find the records they needed and be gone before dawn broke. The rest of Friday passed in preparation. Alexander used his connections to acquire a set of lockpicks, not his first such acquisition, as certain investigations had required such tools in the past. He also arranged for his most trusted servant, James, to have the carriage ready and waiting several blocks from the Whitmore building at midnight on Sunday. Saturday brought news both good and troubling. Samuel Green reported that his investigation into Whitmore and Sons had revealed rumors of financial irregularities dating back decades, but nothing concrete enough to present to authorities. Meanwhile, Alexander learned through his contacts in the police department that Edmund Whitmore had been putting pressure on officials to expedite Thomas's trial, pushing for a swift conviction. That evening, Alexander visited Josephine at her boarding house to finalize their plans. They sat in the small parlor, speaking in low voices as night fell outside the windows. The landlady had retired for the evening, leaving them in a privacy that felt both thrilling and slightly improper. "Are you frightened?" Alexander asked, studying Josephine's face in the lamplight. "Terrified," she admitted, "but I would be more frightened of doing nothing. At least this way. I am fighting for Thomas rather than simply hoping someone else will save him." "You are quite remarkable, Josephine Ashford," Alexander said softly. "I have known many people in my life, wealthy society ladies, cunning criminals, brilliant minds, but I have never met anyone quite like you." She met his gaze, and in her eyes, Alexander saw a reflection of the feelings stirring in his own heart. "Nor I anyone like you, Alexander Montgomery. When I came to your door that rainy night, I hoped for help. I did not expect to find a partner or a friend." "Is that what we are?" Alexander asked, his voice dropping lower. "Friends?" The air between them seemed charged with possibility. Josephine's lips parted as if to speak, but before she could answer, the moment was interrupted by footsteps in the hallway. They drew apart as another boarder passed by, and the spell was broken, though the tension remained. "I should go," Alexander said, rising reluctantly. "Tomorrow night will require all our focus and courage. You should rest." "As should you," Josephine replied, walking him to the door. At the threshold, she reached out and took his hand briefly. "Whatever happens tomorrow, Alexander, thank you for believing in me, for trusting me enough to include me in this." Alexander squeezed her hand gently before releasing it. "We shall succeed, Josephine. I promise you that." As his carriage carried him home through the Saturday night streets, Alexander reflected on how profoundly his life had changed in just 4 days. He had begun this week as a solitary man, brilliant but isolated, using his gifts to solve puzzles for others while keeping his own heart carefully guarded. Now, as he prepared to break into a building and risk his reputation for a woman he barely knew, Alexander realized that some part of him had been waiting for exactly this. Not the case itself, but the person who came with it. Josephine had awakened something in him that he had not even known was sleeping. Sunday arrived with deceptive calm. Alexander attended church services as he always did, maintaining appearances, while his mind raced through the plan for that evening. He ate a quiet dinner alone in his study, watching the sun set over Boston and wondering if Josephine was watching the same sunset, feeling the same mixture of anticipation and dread. At 11 o'clock, dressed in dark clothing unsuitable for a man of his station, Alexander left his mansion through a side entrance and made his way on foot to where James waited with an unmarked carriage. They collected Josephine from a corner 2 blocks from her boarding house, and Alexander's breath caught when he saw her. She too wore dark clothing, a simple black dress with a cloak, and her hair was pinned severely back. She looked like a character from a Gothic novel, beautiful and determined and slightly dangerous. "Are you ready?" he asked as she climbed into the carriage. "I am," she replied, though he could see her hands trembling slightly as she folded them in her lap. The drive to the commercial district was conducted in tense silence. The streets were largely empty at this late hour, with only the occasional night watchman or late-returning gentleman to be seen. The Whitmore building loomed dark and silent when they arrived, its windows like empty eyes staring down at the empty street. James positioned the carriage several blocks away as planned, and Alexander and Josephine approached the building on foot, keeping to the shadows. The window Alexander had identified was exactly where he remembered it, partially concealed by overgrown bushes that had not been trimmed in months. Using his tools, Alexander worked the lock with practiced efficiency, and within minutes, the window swung open with barely a whisper of sound. "Ladies first," he murmured, helping Josephine through the opening before following himself. They found themselves in a storage room filled with crates and supplies. Moonlight filtered through grimy windows, providing just enough illumination to navigate. Alexander produced a small dark lantern from his coat, opening its shutter only enough to provide a narrow beam of light. Together they made their way through the silent building, every creak of the floorboards seeming impossibly loud in the darkness. They climbed the stairs to the 3rd floor, where Alexander remembered seeing a door marked Archives during his visit. The archives room was locked, but Alexander's picks made short work of it. Inside, they found themselves surrounded by shelves upon shelves of ledgers, documents, and files stretching back decades. The task of finding what they needed suddenly seemed overwhelming. "Where do we even begin?" Josephine whispered, We begin with 1870, Alexander replied, running his lantern beam along the shelves until he found ledgers from that year. He pulled several volumes down and they set to work, poring over pages of financial records by the dim light. For an hour they searched in tense silence, finding nothing but routine business transactions. Then Josephine gasped softly, "Alexander, look at this." He moved to her side, looking over her shoulder at the ledger she held. There, in careful script, was a series of payments made in late 1870 to a company called Maritime Acquisitions Limited. The amounts were substantial, tens of thousands of dollars, but what caught Alexander's attention was a notation in the margin. Per agreement, no official record to be kept. E.W. E.W. Edmund Whitmore. Josephine breathed. But what was he purchasing that he did not want officially recorded? They continued searching and found more references to maritime acquisitions scattered throughout the following years, always with the same notation about keeping no official records. Then, in a file from 1871, they found a newspaper clipping that had been folded and tucked between pages, clearly saved by someone, though whether Whitmore himself or one of his clerks, there was no way to know. The clipping reported on a scandal involving Maritime Acquisitions Limited, which had been discovered to be a front company for importing goods without paying proper customs duties. Several businessmen had been investigated, though no charges had ultimately been filed due to lack of evidence. He was smuggling, Alexander said with quiet certainty. Whitmore built his fortune on smuggling, and the watch was payment from someone, probably the owner of Maritime Acquisitions, for his participation or his silence. That is why he could never let anyone examine it too closely. The inscription would lead to questions he could not afford to answer. "And Thomas?" Josephine added, her voice shaking with anger and revelation. Thomas discovered that the same pattern was continuing. Current financial irregularities following the same model as these old ones. Mr. Whitmore never stopped his corrupt practices. He simply became more sophisticated about hiding them. They gathered all the relevant documents, carefully photographing them with a small camera Alexander had brought for exactly this purpose. As they worked, neither noticed the shadow that fell across the frosted glass of the archives room door, nor heard the soft footsteps retreating back down the hallway. It was only when they were preparing to leave, documents secured in Alexander's satchel, that they heard it, the unmistakable sound of the building's main door opening, followed by heavy footsteps and voices. "Someone is here," Josephine whispered, her face pale in the lantern light. Alexander extinguished the lantern immediately, plunging them into darkness. Through the archives room door, they could hear the voices growing closer, climbing the stairs, and one of those voices was unmistakably Edmund Whitmore's. "I tell you, Gerald, someone is here." The watchman reported seeing a light on the third floor. "If it is reporters or competitors trying to dig into our business, we will deal with them severely." Alexander's mind raced. They were trapped. The only exit from the archives room was the door, which would lead them directly into Whitmore's path. The window was too high and too narrow to provide escape, and in moments their presence would be discovered. Alexander's hand found Josephine's in the darkness, squeezing it once, a silent message of reassurance he was not entirely certain he felt himself. His mind worked frantically, cataloging options, discarding impossibilities, searching for any path forward that would not end in disaster for them both. The footsteps were growing closer, accompanied by the swinging beam of a lantern that cast moving shadows under the archives room door. Then Alexander's eyes caught something he had not noticed before. A second door at the far end of the archives room, nearly invisible in the darkness because it was painted the same color as the walls. Without hesitation, he pulled Josephine toward it, praying it would be unlocked, praying it would lead somewhere other than a closet or dead end. The handle turned. Alexander could have wept with relief. They slipped through just as they heard Whitmore's voice directly outside the archives room. "The door is unlocked. I know I locked it yesterday. Someone has been here." The door through which they had escaped led to a narrow maintenance stairwell, clearly meant for servants or workers to move between floors without using the main stairs. Alexander and Josephine descended as quickly as they dared, their footsteps muffled by the thick dust that suggested this passage was rarely used. Behind them, they heard Whitmore's angry voice echoing through the archives room, followed by the sound of things being moved and searched. They emerged on the ground floor in a corridor near the loading docks. The large doors were locked from the inside, but Alexander spotted a smaller personnel entrance. Within seconds, they were outside in the cold night air, running through the shadows until they reached the street where James waited with the carriage. "Drive," Alexander commanded as they tumbled inside. Quickly, but not so fast as to attract attention. As the carriage pulled away, Alexander and Josephine sat in breathless silence, their hearts pounding. Only when they had put several blocks between themselves and the Whitmore building did Josephine begin to laugh, a sound edged with hysteria and relief in equal measure. "We did it," she gasped. "We actually did it. We have the evidence." Alexander found himself laughing as well, the tension of the past hour releasing in waves. "We nearly did not. Another minute and we would have been discovered. My heart may never recover from the strain." Their laughter faded, and suddenly they were simply two people sitting close together in a dark carriage, still holding hands from their flight through the building. The danger had passed, but the intensity of emotion it had generated remained, transforming into something else entirely. "Josephine," Alexander began, his voice low and rough with feeling, "what we just did was reckless and dangerous and entirely improper." "I know," she replied softly, her green eyes luminous even in the darkness of the carriage. "And I would do it again in a heartbeat if you asked me to," he continued, his free hand coming up to cup her cheek. "Somewhere in the past 5 days investigating this case, working beside you, I have developed feelings that I cannot ignore and can no longer pretend are merely professional respect." Josephine's breath caught. "Alexander, let me finish," he said gently. "I know this is sudden. I know we have known each other for less than a week. But I also know that I have never met anyone who challenges me, inspires me, and captivates me the way you do. When this is over, when your brother is free, I would very much like the opportunity to court you properly, if you would permit it." "You do not need to wait," Josephine whispered, leaning into his touch. "I felt it too, from the moment you agreed to help me. Perhaps even from that first moment in your study when you looked at me and truly saw me, not just a woman in distress, but a person with a mind and capabilities of my own. That is a rare gift, Alexander Montgomery, and I treasure it more than you know." In the intimacy of the darkened carriage, Alexander drew her closer, and their lips met in a kiss that seemed to contain all the fear, excitement, danger, and possibility of the night. It was gentle yet passionate, tentative yet certain, and when they finally drew apart, both knew that something fundamental had shifted between them. "We still have work to do," Alexander said eventually, though he kept her hand clasped in his. "Tomorrow is the preliminary hearing. We need to present this evidence in a way that cannot be ignored or dismissed." Josephine nodded, her practical mind reasserting itself even as her heart still raced. "Mr. Whitmore will deny everything. He has influence with judges and police. But we have something he does not," Alexander countered. "We have documentation proving the watch was never a family heirloom. We have evidence of his corrupt business practices spanning decades, and we have the element of surprise. He does not know we have these documents. He will walk into that courtroom expecting an easy victory, and instead, we will expose him for what he truly is." The carriage delivered Josephine to her boarding house first. Before she descended, Alexander caught her hand one final time. "Get some rest. Tomorrow we change everything. Tomorrow we free Thomas," she agreed. "And then, Alexander Montgomery, you and I are going to have a very long conversation about our future." The smile she gave him as she disappeared into her building carried more promise than words could convey. Alexander returned home with his mind already turning over strategies for the hearing. He spent what remained of the night preparing his presentation, organizing the documents they had obtained, and composing a detailed account of their investigation for his attorney, Samuel Green. By the time dawn broke over Boston, Alexander had a plan. It was audacious and would likely make him some powerful enemies, but it would work. It had to work. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for 2 o'clock at the courthouse on Pemberton Square. Alexander arrived at noon to meet with Samuel Green and review their strategy. Green, a sharp-featured man in his 40s with the cunning of a fox and the determination of a bulldog, listened to Alexander's account with growing excitement. "This is explosive material, Alexander," Green said, reviewing the photographs and documents. "If presented correctly, this does not merely free Thomas Ashford. It potentially brings down one of Boston's most prominent businessmen. Are you certain you want to proceed? Whitmore will retaliate." "I am certain," Alexander replied, Justice matters more than social standing or business relationships. Besides, I have a personal interest in seeing this through." He smiled slightly, thinking of Josephine. At 1 o'clock, Josephine arrived at the courthouse, accompanied by her aunt from Cambridge, a formidable woman named Margaret Ashford who had come to provide moral support. Josephine wore her best dress, a deep emerald green that brought out her eyes, and though she looked pale and anxious, she held her head high with the dignity Alexander had come to admire so deeply. "Are you ready?" he asked quietly, meeting her in the corridor outside the courtroom. "I am ready," she confirmed. "Thomas, I spoke with him this morning. He knows what we discovered, and he is prepared to testify if needed. But I believe we can present such compelling evidence that his testimony will be merely confirmatory rather than crucial." The courtroom filled quickly. News of the hearing had spread, as such things always did in Boston society, and many had come to witness the fate of the young clerk accused of stealing from Edmund Whitmore. Whitmore himself sat in the front row, looking prosperous and confident, his attorney beside him, a man named Harold Bentley, known for his aggressive tactics and high fees. Gerald Whitmore was conspicuously absent, supposedly still in New York. Judge Harrison Pembroke presided, a man in his 60s with a reputation for fairness tempered by practicality. He was known to respect evidence above all else, which was precisely what Alexander was counting on. Thomas was brought in, looking thin and frightened, but standing straighter when he saw Josephine in the gallery. She smiled at him, a smile full of hope and reassurance, and Alexander saw the young man's shoulders straighten further. The prosecutor, a junior attorney named Martin Hayes, presented the case against Thomas with efficient boredom, clearly viewing this as an open and shut matter. He described the theft, cited Gerald Whitmore's testimony as recorded in a sworn statement, and requested that the defendant be bound over for trial. Then it was Samuel Green's turn to respond, and the atmosphere in the courtroom began to shift. "Your Honor," Green began, his voice carrying clearly through the room, "the defense moves for immediate dismissal of all charges against Thomas Ashford on the grounds that no theft occurred. Furthermore, we are prepared to present evidence that Mr. Thomas Ashford was falsely accused as part of a deliberate scheme to silence him and prevent him from exposing widespread financial fraud at Whitmore and Sons." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Edmund Whitmore's face flushed dark red, and his attorney shot to his feet. "Your Honor, this is outrageous. These are baseless accusations designed to deflect from the defendant's guilt." Judge Pembroke raised his hand for silence. "Mr. Green, those are serious allegations. I trust you have evidence to support them?" "Substantial evidence, Your Honor. If I may call my first witness, Mr. Alexander Montgomery." Alexander took the stand, was sworn in, and began his testimony. He spoke clearly and methodically, describing how he had been retained by Josephine Ashford to investigate her brother's case. He detailed his visit to the jeweler Nathaniel Winters and presented the ledger entry proving that the supposedly stolen watch had been commissioned by Edmund Whitmore in 1870, not inherited as claimed. "The inscription," Alexander explained, "reads to Edmund for services rendered, 1870. This is not the inscription one places on a family heirloom, Your Honor. This is the inscription on a payment." He then introduced the documents they had obtained, though he carefully avoided explaining exactly how they had been obtained, describing them only as financial records from Whitmore and Sons that came into my possession during the course of my investigation. These documents, he explained, showed a pattern of irregular financial transactions dating back to 1870 and continuing to the present day. Thomas Ashford discovered these current irregularities in the course of his work, Alexander continued. He was preparing to report them to Mr. Whitmore when he was suddenly accused of theft. "The timing, Your Honor, is hardly coincidental." Edmund Whitmore's attorney objected repeatedly, but Judge Pembroke overruled him each time, clearly intrigued by the evidence being presented. The prosecutor, Hayes, looked increasingly uncomfortable, realizing that what he had thought was a simple theft case had become something far more complex. When Alexander finished his testimony, Green called Nathaniel Winters to the stand. The elderly jeweler was nervous but truthful, confirming the details of the watch's creation and the unusual circumstances surrounding its commission. Then came the moment Alexander had been waiting for. Green requested permission to call an additional witness, one who had just arrived at the courthouse with crucial information. The courtroom doors opened, and a man in his 60s entered, well-dressed but with the weathered appearance of someone who had spent years at sea. He was escorted to the witness stand and sworn in as Captain Richard Morrison, retired. "Captain Morrison," Green began, "you sent word to Mr. Montgomery this morning that you had information relevant to this case. Please tell the court what you know." Morrison cleared his throat. "I read about this hearing in the newspapers, and I recognize the name Edmund Whitmore. You see, back in 1870, I was first mate on a merchant vessel. My captain at the time was a man named John Blackwood, and he ran a company called Maritime Acquisitions Limited. We were engaged in importing goods without proper customs documentation, smuggling, to speak plainly. Edmund Whitmore was one of our partners. He would receive the goods at his warehouse and distribute them through his legitimate business, hiding the true source. In return, he received a substantial cut of the profits." The courtroom erupted in shocked murmurs. Whitmore shot to his feet, his face apoplectic. "This is lies. Slander, I demand." "Mr. Whitmore, sit down," Judge Pembroke commanded. "Captain Morrison, how can you substantiate these claims?" "I kept records, Your Honor. Call it insurance, if you will. When the business collapsed and my captain disappeared with most of the money, I kept documents proving who our partners had been, thinking they might be useful someday. I have bills of lading, correspondence, and financial records. They are all signed by Edmund Whitmore." Morrison produced a folder of yellowed documents from his coat, and Green brought them to the judge. As Pembroke examined them, his expression grew increasingly grave. "Your Honor," Green said, "these documents prove that Edmund Whitmore built his business fortune on criminal activity. The watch in question was payment for his participation in that criminal enterprise. When Thomas Ashford began discovering that similar corrupt practices were continuing in Whitmore's current business, Whitmore needed to silence him. The false accusation of theft was the method chosen." Judge Pembroke studied the documents for several long minutes, while the courtroom waited in tense silence. Finally, he looked up. "Mr. Hayes, does the prosecution wish to continue pursuing charges against Thomas Ashford?" The young prosecutor glanced at the evidence, at Edmund Whitmore's furious face, and at his own career hanging in the balance. "No, Your Honor. In light of this new evidence, the prosecution moves to dismiss all charges." "Motion granted," Pembroke said immediately. "Thomas Ashford, you are free to go. All charges are dismissed." He turned his severe gaze on Edmund Whitmore. "As for you, Mr. Whitmore, I am referring this matter to the district attorney for investigation into possible fraud, corruption, and false accusation. You will remain in Boston and make yourself available for questioning. Bailiff, please ensure Mr. Whitmore understands the gravity of his situation." The courtroom exploded into chaos. Reporters rushed to get statements, spectators exclaimed and gossiped, and Edmund Whitmore found himself suddenly surrounded by police officers with very serious expressions. His attorney was frantically trying to manage the situation, but it was clear that Whitmore's world had just collapsed around him. In the midst of the chaos, Thomas Ashford was released from custody and immediately embraced by his sister. Alexander watched as Josephine held her brother tightly, tears streaming down her face. Tears of relief and joy and vindication. When she finally released Thomas, her eyes found Alexander's across the crowded courtroom, and the gratitude and love he saw there made everything worthwhile. Outside the courthouse, the autumn sun was shining brightly, as though the sky itself was celebrating justice served. Alexander found Josephine on the courthouse steps, Thomas beside her along with their Aunt Margaret. "Mr. Montgomery," Thomas said, his voice thick with emotion, "I do not know how I can ever thank you. You saved my life, my freedom, my future. I am forever in your debt." Alexander shook the young man's hand warmly. "You owe me nothing, Thomas. Your sister's courage and determination are what truly saved you. I merely helped her find the evidence." "You did far more than that," Josephine said softly, her green eyes shining. "You believed in us when no one else would. You risked your reputation, your safety, everything to help people you barely knew. That is the mark of a truly good man." Aunt Margaret, who had been observing the interaction between Alexander and Josephine with shrewd eyes, smiled knowingly. "Mr. Montgomery, would you do us the honor of joining us for dinner this evening? It would give us an opportunity to properly celebrate Thomas's freedom and express our gratitude." "I would be delighted," Alexander replied, though his eyes never left Josephine's face. The dinner that evening at a respectable restaurant in the Back Bay was a celebration in the truest sense. Thomas's color had returned, and he spoke animatedly about his plans to seek employment elsewhere, perhaps in a law firm, inspired by what he had witnessed in the courtroom. Aunt Margaret regaled them with stories of Josephine and Thomas's childhood, painting a picture of two siblings who had always looked out for each other. But throughout the evening, Alexander found his attention drawn again and again to Josephine. In the warm gaslight of the restaurant, with happiness softening her features, she was radiant. And when their eyes met across the table, as they did frequently, Alexander felt that same connection, stronger now, deepened by what they had endured together. After dinner, Alexander offered to escort Josephine home while Thomas and Aunt Margaret took a separate carriage. As they walked through the evening streets of Boston, the gas lamps casting pools of golden light on the cobblestones, Alexander took Josephine's hand. "You know," he said conversationally, "in all the excitement today, we never finished that conversation we began last night. About our future." Josephine smiled up at him. "Did we not? How forgetful of us." "Entirely unacceptable," Alexander agreed, his tone light, but his expression serious. "Allow me to remedy that oversight. Miss Josephine Ashford, would you do me the very great honor of allowing me to court you with the intention of one day making you my wife?" Josephine stopped walking, turning to face him fully. In the lamplight, her auburn hair glowed like burnished copper, and her green eyes were luminous with emotion. "Alexander Montgomery, I would be honored. But I must warn you, I am not the sort of wife who will be content to simply manage your household and attend social functions. I have developed quite a taste for investigation, and I expect to be your partner in all things." Alexander laughed, the sound full of joy and affection. "My dear Josephine, I would have it no other way. I have no use for a conventional wife. I want a partner, an equal, someone who will challenge me and work beside me. I believe I have found exactly that in you." "Then yes," Josephine said, moving closer to him. "Yes to courtship, yes to partnership, yes to whatever future we build together." There, on a Boston street corner with autumn leaves swirling around their feet and the city humming with life around them, Alexander kissed Josephine again. It was a kiss that promised not just romance but adventure, not just love but respect, not just passion but true partnership. In the weeks that followed, Edmund Whitmore's empire crumbled. The investigation revealed decades of corruption, tax evasion, and fraud. Gerald Whitmore, when finally located and questioned, broke under pressure and testified against his father in exchange for leniency. Whitmore himself was convicted and sentenced to 10 years in prison. His business dissolved, his fortune seized to pay restitution to those he had defrauded. Thomas Ashford, vindicated and free, found excellent employment with Samuel Green's law firm, where his attention to detail and personal experience with justice made him an invaluable assistant to the attorneys. He would go on to become a lawyer himself, specializing in defending those falsely accused. As for Alexander and Josephine, their courtship scandalized and delighted Boston society in equal measure. The billionaire detective and the young woman who had dared to investigate alongside him became the subject of much gossip and speculation, but they paid it no mind. They were too busy planning their future together, a future that would include not just marriage and partnership, but the opening of a detective agency where they would work together, solving mysteries and serving justice. On a spring morning in 1896, 6 months after that fateful rainy night when Josephine had first knocked on Alexander's door, they stood together in the parlor of the Montgomery mansion. Outside, the gardens were blooming with new life, and inside, Alexander had just presented Josephine with a ring. Not an ostentatious display of wealth, but a simple band of gold with a single emerald that matched her eyes. "To new beginnings," Alexander said softly, slipping the ring onto her finger. "To partnership," Josephine replied, her smile radiant. "In all things, for all time." They kissed then, sealing their engagement and their future. And though neither could know exactly what adventures lay ahead, they knew they would face them together. Two remarkable individuals who had found in each other not just love, but the rarest gift of all, a true equal, a genuine partner, a kindred spirit who made the whole of life richer and more meaningful. The story that had begun with a whispered plea in a storm had ended with a promise made in sunshine. Thomas was free, justice had been served, and two hearts that had found each other in the midst of mystery and danger had discovered that the greatest mystery of all, the mystery of love, was also the most rewarding to solve. As spring gave way to summer and their wedding day approached, Alexander and Josephine often reflected on those intense days of investigation, danger, and discovery. The case that had brought them together had changed both their lives in ways neither could have anticipated. But that, they agreed, was the nature of the best mysteries. They revealed not just solutions to puzzles, but truths about ourselves and possibilities we never knew existed. And so, in the end, the girl who had whispered urgently about checking a pocket had led the billionaire detective to discover something far more valuable than evidence or truth. She had led him to discover love, partnership, and the joy of finding someone who saw the world as he did, as a place full of mysteries waiting to be solved, injustices waiting to be righted, and adventures waiting to be shared. Their future stretched before them, bright with promise, rich with possibility, and built on the strongest foundation of all: mutual respect, shared purpose, and genuine love. The Montgomery Detective Agency would open that fall, with Montgomery and Montgomery painted on the door, for by then Josephine Ashford would be Josephine Montgomery, equal partner in business as in life. But that, as they say, is a story for another time. For now, their story ends as all the best love stories do, not with an ending, but with a beginning, and with two people standing together, ready to face whatever mysteries the future might bring, knowing that together they could solve anything.